Well, hello, friends and fellow wackadoos. It is so nice to see you again. I hope that your New Year's is going swimmingly so far. I'm back with you again for another true crime case. Thank you so much for being here. This is our first case of 2022, and I thought we would start it off with a serial killer. Just taking it back to true crime basics. If this is your first time here, hi, my name's Rachel, and I hope you'll consider subscribing and joining us here again sometime. The man that we're talking about today sort of isn't as, I don't want to say popular, but infamous as some of the others, Bundy, Dahmer, Gacy. But that's a little weird because he remains the most prolific serial killer in New York history. He had a total victim count of 17. Now that is quite high. And because that's quite high, this is probably going to be a slightly longer video. We got a lot to get to, so let's get started. New York couple Bernard and Jean Rifkin really wanted a family, but they were finding that for one reason or another, they were having trouble doing that in the kind of traditional way, and so they turned to adoption. But finding a suitable baby for them was going to be just a little bit more difficult because Bernard, who went by Ben, so I will probably use that name interchangeably, Ben and Jean were Jewish, and they wanted to adopt a Jewish baby, a child that would share their religion, their heritage. Jewish heritage is generally considered to be passed down through the mother, and so they were sort of waiting for a Jewish mother who wanted to give her baby up for adoption. And finally, on January 20th, 1959, the Rifkins' dreams came true. A baby boy had been born that day to Jewish parents who were teenagers apparently and just not really ready to take care of a child. And so through a Jewish-specific adoption agency, the Rifkins were able to get him about 3 weeks after he was born. And they named him Joel David Rifkin. 3 years later, they were also blessed to be able to add a little girl to the family who they called Jan. And I have to assume that her name is Janet because Jan is a strange name for, can you picture a baby named Jan? I feel like they didn't call her Jan when she was little, but that's neither here nor there. Point is, their happy little family was complete at this point. And by all accounts, it was a happy family. In a really lovely change from the kinds of situations we usually talk about in this case, Joel seemed to be loved and well taken care of. He wasn't abused or neglected. His parents weren't drunks or drug users. They had a nice middle-class life. It was stable, normal, completely unremarkable. And Joel himself, in interviews, has recalled feeling like he was a pretty happy child until about the age of 5 or 6. Around that time, the Rifkin family relocated out of the city and into a suburb on Long Island called East Meadow. And then things really still were kind of okay until he was enrolled in school for his first year at Prospect Avenue Elementary. This is where things really started to go downhill for young Joel. See, when he was sort of juxtaposed, put up there next to other kids his age, the ways in which he was different became a little more obvious. He was sort of slow and awkward. I don't mean slow mentally. I mean physically he was slow. It actually ended up earning him a nickname among his peers. They called him Turtle. He just struggled overall, both academically and socially. He kind of became a both verbal and physical punching bag for his classmates. They just didn't like him. Some of this dislike may have come from the fact that everybody thought he was stupid. He didn't really get good grades. He really barely got by. And so people kind of thought he was dumb. He wasn't dumb. He was tested at an IQ of 128, which is well above average. But what he was dyslexic, and that was completely undiagnosed and went undiagnosed, I believe, until his adulthood. So anybody who's ever struggled with some kind of learning disability like dyslexia understands that it is a serious, serious hindrance to your academic ability, even though it has nothing at all to do with how intelligent you are. The poor kid just had a sort of lumbering and clumsy stance. Plus, he wore glasses, which for some reason used to be a bigger deal. I don't know. I wore glasses my whole life. I know tons of people who wore glasses and never were made fun of for it. But Joel definitely was picked on for that. And he had less than zero athletic ability, so he wasn't even able to sort of be a part of a team and connect with other boys, because that's a lot of the way that young males get to know each other, get to interact, is through sports. Young women too, but especially at this time, definitely more so males. And of course, a lot of the boys in the neighborhood and at school saw this lack of athletic ability as somehow emasculine, and that added to his ridicule. Joel's dad had been quite an athlete in his day. He was also very studious. He was very academically gifted, and so this really strained their relationship a little bit. You know how it is. It was nothing terrible, but when a parent has a hard time relating to their child or feels frustrated because they think they're not trying hard enough, sometimes that can leave some tension, especially with adolescents. Joel's dad would try to take him out and teach him how to throw a ball, play catch. Joel said that he was just as likely to catch the ball with his face as he was to catch it in his hand. And the kind of ridicule that Joel had to put up with at school, especially junior high and then going into high school, was really quite severe. This wasn't just a little bit of teasing. This was physical abuse. This was head in the toilet. This was getting beat up after school, during school, before school. He would actually wait until the very last minute to arrive for his classes so that he could minimize his interaction with his classmates. And then, of course, he would go home. He never told his parents that any of this was going on for him at school. Nobody really knows why. They seem like pretty nice and understanding people. But he would go home, and then his father would try to help him with his homework. He couldn't get it. He would try to help him with his athletic stuff. He couldn't get it. Ben would apparently get quite frustrated and have to walk away for a little while because he just couldn't get through to his son. And this left Joel feeling incredibly inadequate and like a total disappointment to his parents, especially his father, whose approval he really desired. Joel also knew he was adopted too. I'm sure that sort of fed into these feelings of inadequacy because they chose him. They wanted him very desperately and waited for him to make sure they had just the right baby. It's not like in a situation where it's like, well, this is the family you were born into. They, in a way, sought him specifically. And so I can see how that would perhaps further, and I'm just conjecturing here, but that could further that feeling like, oh, they picked me because they wanted to have a great son and I'm just a loser and whatever. And mind you, again, he didn't know he was dyslexic, so he probably could not fully understand why he was having such a hard time grasping these subjects in school either. But despite the bullying and the ridicule and all the abuse he was suffering at school, Joel did still try to fit in. He did join the track team at one point, even though he was pretty slow in his movement. Maybe he thought that would help him along, maybe get him a little more athletic prowess. But instead, his supposed teammates just made fun of him and also dunked his head in the toilet, swirly style. There was a girl on the track team who was actually being nice to him, and there were actually a few girls who he went to school with who said he was perfectly nice. Ironic, considering what he later did. Anyway, he was talking to her. They were kind of hanging out a little. She was at least being friendly to him. I don't think it was anything more than that. Well, The boys on the track team got word that he had dared to try to strike up a friendship with a girl, and they cornered him while he was inside the library. I believe this was the public library. They sort of waited outside for him with eggs and threatening postures. So when he went to leave, he saw them all lined up out there, ready to give him a serious beatdown. Naturally, he didn't want to get that beatdown. So he called his dad to come pick him up, which he did. Now, this saved him at the time, but of course, now, because he wasn't willing to come out and face his aggressors, they all made fun of him for being a pansy and not just standing up for himself like a man. As a matter of fact, he never stood up for himself. He never hit back. He never fought back. When they would come after him, he would take a couple of punches and then he would just fall on the ground and curl up in the fetal position until they left. So as well as being awkward and people making fun of him for being stupid, which he wasn't, four-eyed because he wore glasses, he also got a reputation as a bit of a sissy and a crybaby. Oh, and he joined the yearbook club. So because he couldn't really do the things that his dad wanted him to do, the traditionally masculine stuff, he joined his mother, mostly in her hobbies, gardening and photography. He was actually quite good at photography, and so he tried to join the yearbook team so that he could take pictures. And the first day that he was there on the yearbook committee, they stole his camera. So that ended that. Now, like I kind of touched on before, according to classmates that they've interviewed now later on as adults, Joel never really did anything wrong in particular. Kids just had it out for him. But a lot of people just described him as sort of shy and awkward, but perfectly pleasant, perfectly nice, just quiet, but not particularly unpleasant to be around. Now, I am not suggesting that his classmates who bullied him were responsible for how he turned out. There are millions of people who get bullied and don't end up being serial killers. There was clearly something that lived in him that we can't explain necessarily. There was something that lived in him, but this did not help. I actually watched a really interesting documentary that they put out. I'll find it and I'll link it in the description. But this documentary was using sort of scientific explanations and talking about experiments that they've done to help describe why some people become antisocial, why some people become murderers. And they were talking specifically to Joel Rifkin. They scanned his brain and they were seeing that there was a lot less frontal lobe activity going on than in a normal brain. And this seems to be something that they find a lot with people who are violent criminals and who go back to jail time and time again for criminal activity, especially violent criminal activity, that they have this sort of diminished capacity in the frontal lobe, which is the part of your brain that's responsible for impulse control. Whether that was something he was born with or his brain just didn't develop because of bullying or whatever, there's no way to know that for sure. But that is kind of just an interesting science-y bit that I wanted to throw in. People who have ADHD also have a little bit of diminished capacity in that frontal lobe area. So not that people with ADHD are more likely to commit crime or anything like that. I just thought it was interesting and it lends maybe that could someday lead to some explanation for why some people end up being serial killers. So because he was so ostracized and so tormented anytime he left his house, Joel isolated himself a lot. He just spent a lot of time alone in his room. But what nobody knew was that while he was isolating himself alone in his room, he had begun nurturing some pretty disturbing fantasies involving sexual assault and strangulation of women. No one knows where he got these ideas. In particular, he doesn't, his parents don't. But he does talk about seeing the movie Frenzy, which is an older movie that does involve a man. It's like a thriller or a horror movie, an old one that involves a man who targets sex workers and he strangles them. And apparently Joel kind of thinks that this gave him an idea, but he was having these kind of violent fantasies before he ever saw that movie. So that's not like responsible for it. Okay. Movies don't cause people to become disturbed. So that's how he spent most of his adolescence, just alone in his room in Joel World. And Joel World is a place that most of us would find quite wackadoodle. And honestly, I think Joel was fairly bothered by it too. But just like he never talked to his parents about all of the violence that he was experiencing at school, he also never told them about the violence he was experiencing in his head. These thoughts just remained private and escalated in his mind. So by 1977, when his parents gave him a car, these fantasies had become obsessions. And almost as soon as he had the car, he started using it to drive into the city and pick up sex workers. After high school, he did end up going to community college, but before too long, he was back at his parents' house, and he would kind of do this back and forth thing multiple times, usually because anytime he had a little money in his pocket, he was using it to go and pick up streetwalkers. Finally, he just gave up on school altogether in 1984, moving back home for the final time. And there he would remain until his later arrest in 1993. There was a short period of time where he was out doing a study thing, and we'll touch on that in a little bit, but his residence was at his parents' home. And even though he was living at home with his mother and father, and I believe his sister was also living there at least some of this time, he kept up his habit of going into the city to purchase sex. He had a huge amount of trouble keeping any kind of employment for any long period of time, but when he did have a job, that's where his money went. Then in 1986, his father, who was already quite sick with emphysema, was diagnosed with prostate cancer. He fought as long as he could with the cancer, as long as he felt that he could. But in February of 1987, he was in so much pain from the treatments, from the cancer, that he felt his only way out was through passing himself away. And so he did take an overdose of barbiturates. He fell into a coma, and 4 days later, he died. Joel, at this time, was already severely depressed. He had suffered from depression most of his life, and the death of his father just made him spiral down further. He had the feeling that Ben had left this world never having felt proud of his son. Joel had wanted very desperately to live up to his father's expectations, and he just couldn't. And this left him with a terrible empty feeling, a feeling that any chance he may have had to make up for his shortcomings in his father's eyes was gone. And it was. To be honest, I don't really get the impression that Ben was as disappointed in Joel as Joel seemed to think he was. So some of this could have been created in his head. Some of this could have been the depression talking. You know, when we do have mental illness like that, sometimes things can seem a little worse than they actually are. But regardless, the reality isn't so much important as Joel's perception is important, and his perception of himself, which after his father's passing was at an all-time low. What makes this all the more tragic is that Joel was just on the verge of doing something that really probably would have pleased his father. In 1988, he was accepted into a horticulture program at the State College of Technology in Farmingdale, New York. It was a 2-year program. He went, he did so well. He was getting A's for the first time in his life. And this is probably because it focused mostly on plants and things like that, not so much reading and math and the subjects that he struggled with. It was something he was not only interested in, but that his dyslexia didn't get in the way of. Unfortunately, Joel also became quite infatuated with one of the female students there. He did try to express these feelings to a certain extent. I think he was sort of vague about it. The feelings were not reciprocated. And because of this, it brought up all those feelings of being alone and isolated and rejected. Feelings that were all too familiar to him. And even while he was in this program, while he was in another town, he was doing so well, seeing some success for the first time in his life, he still couldn't pull himself away from the temptation of visiting sex workers. Now, he wasn't bringing these girls back to his mother's house. She would not have accepted that. But in March of 1989, his mother went on a business trip out of state, and he saw this as a good opportunity to go and bring somebody back home for the first time. So that night, he found a woman who, until recently, was only known as Susie. She was soliciting in the East Village. He got her in his car, drove her around on some errands, picking up drugs, and then took her back to his mother's house. They did what he had paid her to do, and then she fell asleep. But as soon as she woke up, she started demanding that Joel take her to get some more recreational substances. And for one reason or another, Joel just snapped. He grabbed a decorative howitzer shell, which is like a really large bullet that goes in a large gun. It's like a howitzer is sort of almost like a modern cannon. It's a very, very large weapon, and the shells that go inside it are about this big. For whatever reason, his parents had one that was set out as decoration. He grabs this very large, heavy object, and he begins to bludgeon Susie with it until he got tired. But she was still alive. And so he strangled her to death with his hands. He then took her body to the basement, and there he dismembered her with an X-Acto knife. I don't know if you know what an X-Acto knife looks like, but it's usually a small blade, generally used for arts and crafts. It's about that big. I cannot even imagine how he even did this, but he did. He dismembered her. He removed her teeth. He removed all the pads of her fingers so that she had no fingerprints. Then severed her head and placed it in an empty paint can. He then got in his car and drove to New Jersey, dumping garbage bags of body parts along the way, mostly into random bodies of water. But the paint can with her head in it, he tossed out, and it ended up at the edge of a wooded area that was on the Hopewell Valley Golf Club. It was found really soon. It was found the next day by a golfer who was looking for a ball that he had sort of sliced off into the woods, but without any teeth or any distinguishing characteristics. That head was not identified until 2013. It turns out that Susie was actually a woman named Heidi Bulk. Heidi apparently often used the alias Susie when she was working and for other reasons. She had been reported missing in 2001. Now, mind you, she fell victim to Joel in 1989. So it took that long before anyone even reported her missing. But regardless of when it happens or how it happens, we are always very grateful to have Jane Does identified so that we can remember their names and that their families can get closure. So Heidi Bulk was her name. Besides her decapitated head, they never found any of the other remains. In fact, we only even knew that her name was Susie and that she was a victim of Joel Rifkin's because of his later confession. And we will find this to be the case for a lot of these women. So the report that the head had been found on the golf course really freaked Joel out. He was sure that the police were going to come knocking on his door at any minute. But they never did. Months went by. And after a while, Joel's confidence that they were never going to link him to that murder began to grow. And so by late 1990, Joel was pretty settled. And the opportunity to kill again came when Jean once again left out of town for a business trip. This time, Rifkin found Julie Blackbird. Apparently, he liked her because she looked like Madonna, like in the way that she dressed. She had that Madonna thing going on. He also took Julie back to his mom's house, and after the services were rendered, he beat her with a table leg and then strangled her to death. So even though his confidence was up, he was still a little bit nervous about Susie or Heidi's head being found the last time, and so he wanted to make sure that no part of Julie ever resurfaced. So this time after he dismembered her, he put all of her parts in buckets of concrete. And then he dumped those parts into different rivers. Just as he intended, Julie was never found, has never been found. Again, we only even know about this because of his confession and also stuff that they found in his house later. So despite the fact that things were seemingly going so very well for Joel, he still bided his time before he would kill again. But by July of 1991, with Julie's remains still unfound, he went out on the prowl again. 31-year-old Barbara Jacobs would be the next woman to fall prey to Joel's depraved fantasies. Once he got her back to his home, he also beat her with a table leg. The same table leg that he had beat Julie Blackbird with. And then, of course, strangled her to death. This time, he was really confident that nobody was out here looking for these women and he was probably going to get away with it. And the whole dismemberment thing actually really grossed him out. Unlike some killers who we hear about, where like that part of it is kind of the whole point. That's how they get their kicks. That was not Joel. That was something that he did because he felt like he had to. It grossed him out. He didn't like it. And because he felt like, this is something I can get away with pretty easily, he did not dismember Barbara Jacobs. Instead, he wrapped her up in plastic, stuffed her in a cardboard box, and dumped her into the Hudson River. She was found only hours later. But they still didn't ID her. She, again, was not ID'd until Rifkin's confession. In fact, the coroner who examined her body decided she had died of a drug overdose, so there was never even any kind of investigation done. So you're going to sit here and you're going to tell me that we don't need to do any kind of investigation into this death because it was just a drug overdose. And then she overdosed on the drugs. She died. And then she wrapped herself in plastic and stuffed herself into a cardboard box. Make it make sense. That is clearly not what happened. I don't know who this coroner is, but that is a bad job. Okay? That is a very, very bad job. Lose your employment bad. And it's so frustrating to me because this is 3 women, 3 victims now, and nobody's even looking for him. So many more women maybe didn't have to die if people had just done their jobs, but I'll get off my soapbox. His confidence bursting and his appetite to kill unquenched, Joel didn't even wait 2 months before going out and picking up 22-year-old Mary Ellen DeLuca on September 1st, 1991. Mary was a beautiful young woman who had unfortunately found herself a slave to a terrible drug habit. And she was out looking for money to support that habit when Joel found her. Apparently, she did agree to sleep with him for money, but she didn't really want to. And she kind of complained about it the whole time. She just was kind of looking for money to get her next fix. I don't think that sex work was really her profession. Just that's pure opinion based on what I read. It seems like maybe this was just something that she was doing or maybe did occasionally when she was really hard up and needed some money, but she didn't really want to do it, but she did want the money, if that makes sense. So this time Mom was home, so Joel could not return to his home with Mary. Instead, he got a cheap motel. And after the agreed upon exchange, he strangled her to death. But because it was the middle of the day, he couldn't just leave with her body. So he placed her in a large steamer trunk that he had bought, it seems specifically for this purpose. He then drove upstate to Cornwall and he left the body at a rest stop. It would be a whole month before anyone found Mary's remains. And once again, they made no connection to Rifkin. So that same month, September of 91, Rifkin picked up Yoon Lee. And Yoon was definitely a professional. Rifkin had used her services multiple times before. This was the first time that he would kill somebody who was previously known to him. He strangled her like the others and unceremoniously dumped her in the East River, where she was found very shortly afterwards on September 23rd. She would fortunately not go unidentified like the others, because she did have a husband who noticed she was missing and was looking for her, and he was able to identify her remains. Now, Joel Rifkin's sixth victim does remain unidentified to this day. He could not remember her name or the name she gave him, and her body has never been recovered. But Joel does remember that he was nearly caught when he was disposing of the body in a river, because he was like under a bridge or something, sort of doing what he was doing, and a couple of police officers came up to him because his car was parked there in the middle of the night by the river and started kind of asking him some questions. But being a quick thinker, okay, Joel picked up some like scrap pieces of metal that were laying around. And as the police officers approached him, he kind of cut them off and like waved them down, was like, "Sorry guys, I'm just out here scrapping some metal." And they just believed him and were like, "All right, man, we'll see you later. Have a good night," and left. He could have been caught that night. He had a body in his car at that time. But once again, he got away with it. This is 6 victims now. 6 victims by the end of 1991. And Rifkin is sliding completely under the radar. No one was even looking for a serial killer. Like, nobody was like, we might have a serial killer out here. Nothing. But you have to keep in mind that so far, most of these women had not been even found. Those that were never identified, or their cause of death was botched by some idiot coroner. They were sex workers, right? We talked about this many times before. I get sort of sick of going over it, but oftentimes they're just not looked for as hard as other groups of people. I think that to some police, not all, but to some officers, some police groups, dying is sort of seen as a hazard of the job. And even if you get some cops and investigators that really do care, they really care, they want to identify these women and find their killers, it can just be hard. Their lifestyle sometimes gets in the way. These are, there's different kinds of work you can do in this area. These women are survival workers. They're not choosing this because it's the career that they really want to have necessarily. They're doing it to get by, to feed themselves, to support a drug habit, whatever it is. They're doing it to get by. So they tend to be very transient. They move around a lot. They don't necessarily have any kind of permanent residence, a lot of them. And beyond that, a lot of times people don't even know what their real names are. They're not even given their real names, or they're not giving their real last names to anybody. They're living out on the margins of society. And that can make tracking down somebody very, very difficult. And if you can't track them down, you can't find their families, then there's not necessarily anybody putting pressure on the police to discover their murderers. So there are just a lot of really unique issues beyond just people not caring. I harp on that all the time, that people just don't care about these women. But even when they do care, investigating situations like this just has some really unique problems that are presented with it. So because nobody's looking for a serial killer and nobody's even connecting that these murders are in any way related to each other, again, only a couple of the bodies were found anyway at this point. So Joel doesn't get like a cutesy nickname, like investigators are looking for the Green River Killer or whatever. And I think that that's a lot of the reason why, as sad as it is, I think that's a lot of the reason why he's not as well known. He did get a couple of little nicknames, but only after he was caught. There was no newspapers printing like another body pulled from the Hudson. Could this be a victim of the Hudson River Killer or anything like that? They're just really not looking for him at all. They're not looking for anybody. And by the very end of December in 1991, Joel killed 28-year-old Lorraine Orvietto. She had grown up on Long Island just like him, in a nice middle-class family just like him. And that family missed her terribly. She had just kind of had a sad story. She got involved with drugs, but she was loved and she was missed. People were looking for her. And it wouldn't be until 6 months later that her remains were found, and another year after that before she was identified. Even though her family had reported that she was missing, her poor mother kept her Christmas presents for 2 years in a row, hoping that she would come back to receive them. My heart goes out to that family. I cannot imagine waiting on your daughter to come home to get her Christmas presents and then finding out 2 years later that she was dead the whole time. So now we get to 1992. In 1992, Joel escalated very quickly. And I would tell you a little bit more about what Joel was doing with his life and out in the world, but you will see by the number of victims that Joel was pretty much spending all of his time murdering women, thinking about murdering women, or disposing of murdered women. This was basically his full-time job at this point. Now, he did start up a small landscaping business at some point, but the business was never that successful. It was failing because he was completely preoccupied with his more homicidal vocation. He had a warehouse that he used to store equipment and things like that for this landscaping business he had. But it pretty much ended up acting as a storage facility for human remains, a go-between when he killed and when he disposed. It's almost like the landscaping was just a front for his actual career. Joel kicked off his 92 spree very early in the year, taking his first victim on January 2nd. This was 39-year-old Mary Ann Holloman. She would be found disposed of in a 55-gallon oil drum, or 55-gallon drum of some variety, in Coney Island Creek. This was the exact same disposal method and location as Lorraine Orvietto. In fact, I'm not 100% sure on this, but I think they were found at the same time. I think when they located one, they located the other. 5 months later, on Mother's Day weekend in May, Rifkin killed Iris Sanchez. She was just 25 years old, a mother. She had a similar sad story to the rest of his victims. Involvement with drugs led her down a path where she was just surviving, and she was distanced from her family and eventually turned to sex work to keep herself afloat. He hastily got rid of her body in like a makeshift dump site, where people, like a field or something where people go and dump their trash, but it's kind of illegal. They're not supposed to dump there. It was an illegal dump site near the airport, and he just stashed her under a mattress. And her remains were still right there, just under a mattress at a dump a year later when he was arrested. Still there. Anna Lopez was killed and found later in the same month in a wooded area off of Interstate 84 in Putnam County, New York. Now, once Joel was arrested, Anna's mother was very outspoken to the courts and to the world, trying to impress upon people that these women were more than just their profession, more than just the circumstances that they had found themselves in, that they had families, that they were loved. All of them, including her daughter, especially her daughter, were not alone. And I personally really hope that having such an outspoken advocate helped people at this time, people on the jury, people in the media, see all of these women as human beings, as not just disposable throwaways. That can happen. That can happen with cases like this, especially when most of these women did have substance use issues and things like that. Especially at that time in the early 90s, there was a really terrible perception of addicts. Things are a little bit different now. We do treat it as a disease, but I would imagine that there were a fair amount of people out there who would have said and thought horrible things like, well, these women are just addicts and sex workers and they maybe deserved what they got. That really was the attitude of a lot of people at that time. I'm glad that we're moving beyond that. And I really hope that Anna Lopez's mom had an impact on some people in that regard. Unfortunately, the next victim we're going to talk about was unidentified, remains unidentified. She was found in New Creek in Brooklyn, and although she was found in 1992, it is believed that she was possibly killed in 1991. In that case, when they found her, they didn't actually go looking for anybody once again because they decided she was a drug mule because of all the cocaine she had in her system at her time of death. So nothing was ever done. It was never investigated as a murder. They just decided she was a drug mule and closed it. Now, over the course of 3 days in July, body parts started washing up and being found in the Hudson River, the East River, and near a place called Governor's Island in New York. All of the remains were determined to belong to Violet O'Neill, a 21-year-old mother who had not been seen since July 16. Joel had actually taken Violet back to his mother's house, something that he had not done for a while. He took her back to his mother's house and he dismembered her in the tub. So I guess maybe he got his taste back for the dismembering stuff. I don't know. Maybe he got worried that too many bodies were being found. It's not really been made very clear why he did that, but that's what he did. 31-year-old North Carolina woman Mary Catherine Williams had been a high school homecoming queen, a college cheerleader. I read at one point she had a relationship with a professional football player. She was, I think, what you'd call a blonde bombshell. She was from a well-off family, beautiful girl. She ended up marrying a man who she had known since high school. They actually eloped in 1987, but unfortunately, by that point in time, she had already developed a pretty serious drug habit and also a debilitating eating disorder. Her new husband loved her very much. He wanted to help her with these issues, but he did end up kind of falling into this partying lifestyle with her. They were always having people over, wild parties, lots of substance use. And at some point, their pretty comfortable middle-class lifestyle was going to not be anymore, right? Because of these issues that they were having. As they fell deeper into drug use, obviously, that poses issues as far as keeping employment and paying bills and having money. So her husband, whose name I didn't write down for some reason, but I believe it's Jay, he suggested that they go their separate ways. Not divorce, but that they go their separate ways and each move home, move to their respective parents' houses, and try to get their lives together. While her husband went to seminary to become a pastor, Mary Catherine went to the Big Apple to pursue a career in acting. And I think that this is a tale as old as time. She was never really able to kick her addictions, and New York gave her ample opportunity to indulge. The couple never divorced, and they did continue to talk from time to time. Sometimes Mary Catherine would call up her husband and try to convince him that he needed to move to New York City with her, that they could start a great new life together, live as husband and wife again, and then she would ghost him before any solid plans were made. From what I could tell, it seemed like she maybe had some periods of sobriety and then would fall off the wagon once again. In 1992, the calls stopped entirely. Now, of course, we know why, because she was killed by Joel Rifkin in October of that year. She was found a few months later on December 21st, but like so many others, she remained unidentified until Joel's confession. The last victim of 1992 was Jenny Soto. She was 23 years old, and she broke all of her fingernails off trying to fight her attacker. Unfortunately, Joel did best her in that fight, but she gave him a few good scratches that he would later have to explain away to his mother and his sister. Jenny was found in November, very close to where Yoon Lee had been found. They were able to identify her. They used her fingerprints, which were in the system from some previous arrests, I believe for solicitation. And her ex-boyfriend, who was also an ex-con, was liked for her murder. So the police suspected that he had done it. Apparently he was kind of a violent guy, but as far as I could tell, nothing was really done about it. I couldn't find any information that he had been arrested or charged or tried for that crime. So maybe they just decided to let it go like they did so many others. Okay, now before we head into 1993 and discuss the final 3 women who would fall prey to Joel Rifkin, I just want to take a second and remind everyone. This is 14 women that this man has slaughtered in cold blood. Not all of them had been found yet. I understand that. That's a lot. That's a lot of people missing. That's a lot of dead bodies found. And no one was looking for him. Okay? He was not some criminal mastermind. He was not so clever that no one could catch him. No one was looking for him. The New York police had not connected any of these murders to each other. And really, there were quite a few things in common. They were all sex workers. They were all strangled. They weren't looking for a serial killer. There was no suspicion that they had a serial killer in their midst. Okay, some of these deaths were not even being investigated as murders at all. Now, of course, we are talking about the early 90s here, so the forensics are a little more limited than they are now. DNA was barely a thing, not even admissible in court at this point, and very hard to get. You had to have a pretty large sample. I don't even know if they were looking for any kind of DNA on any of the remains, but my guess would be due to the disposal method that there would not have probably been enough for them to find anything with the technology that they had at the time. We're talking about New York City in the early 90s, okay? They had not revamped their image yet. They hadn't gotten the money pouring in. At the time, New York was one of the most dangerous, if not the most dangerous city in America. The cops were handling upwards of 2,000 murders per year. If you're interested in knowing a little bit more about New York City in the late 80s and early 90s, in my very, very first true crime video, you'll have to excuse me. It's 8 months ago or so. But you can go watch it. It's the Michael Alig case. If you haven't seen it yet, in part 1, I do discuss a little bit more in depth, not super in depth, but more in depth about what New York City was like at that time. So I'll leave a link to that video in the description if you are interested in that. But the New York of then is not the New York that we know today. And with all of the crime in general, I just think that maybe the cops weren't working as hard to find the identities and the murderers of these women as they could have. But that's just like my opinion, man. You can take it or leave it. But the point is that Rifkin wasn't somehow evading police because he was so smart. They weren't looking for him. So now we're going to move on to 1993, the year that Joel Rifkin took his final 3 victims and then was finally caught by police quite by accident. And I want to thank all of you for sticking with me through this. I know it's been a little bit of a longer video. He had 17 victims. That's a lot. And it's really, really important to me that we go through each and every one of them, because if we don't, and we don't say their names, and we don't learn who they were insofar as we have that information, then all we're really doing here is glorifying killers, and that's not what I am all about. These women deserve to be remembered, and they deserve to have their names heard. We can't just lump them all in together and say, oh, he killed 5 people or he strangled 5 women. These were unique individuals with their own stories and their own troubles, with families and people who loved them, with children. And they are people who had their lives cut short, and they did not deserve to die. I know all of you feel the same way, and that is why I love and appreciate you so much. Joel's first victim of 1993 was 28-year-old Leah Evans. She had ended up working the streets when she was abandoned by her children's father. But again, it seems to me like perhaps she had not been doing this work for very long, or maybe she wasn't a professional at it. It wasn't something she did regularly, because Joel took her to a parking lot to exchange services. And when he asked her to get undressed, she actually started crying. And she told him that there wasn't enough privacy. She needed to have a more private place. Rifkin refused, and he strangled her right then and there before they had done anything together. This was February 27th, but she would not be found until May 9th by some hikers in the woods on the east end of Long Island, buried in a shallow grave. And again, Leah would not be identified until Joel confessed later on. Laura Marquez was also 28 years old when Joel picked her up on April 2nd. This time, he didn't bother with any of the niceties. They didn't have sex, anything like that. He just went straight for her throat. She did try to fight him back, but she was unfortunately unsuccessful. He actually ended up snapping her neck, which is horrendous. He drove out of the county to dump her body. It was in Suffolk County, but she wouldn't be found until his arrest, when he told the police where she was, and then she was finally identified using DNA evidence on August 20th. Rifkin's final victim was Tiffany Bresciani. She was a Louisiana woman who had moved to New York in hopes of becoming an actress and a dancer, and instead she became an addict and a stripper. She was actually the second girl he had picked up on the night of June 24th, but the first one he didn't kill. And that's really not terribly unusual. He did tell the police that he never really went out with the intention to kill these women. He intended to pick them up and pay them for sex. But sometimes it would just happen. There were many women that he picked up and slept with who he did not kill throughout this entire time. He never specifically knew who he was going to do that to. He didn't target them for that purpose, supposedly. He took Tiffany to the parking lot of the New York Post. Yes, the newspaper. And he strangled her there at around 5:30 in the morning. Then he put her body in the back seat and drove around to a couple of stores to buy rope and tarp. And then he was on his way back to his mother's house in East Meadow. Sometime between the time he bought the rope and the tarp and the time he got home, he had wrapped Tiffany's body in the plastic and tied it with the rope and put her in the trunk. This was the trunk of his mother's car, by the way. His truck seemed, I guess it wasn't working at the moment, so he had been borrowing his mother's car. So he puts her in the mother's trunk. But no sooner does he arrive home than his mother demands the keys to her car and says she needs to go shopping. So he hands them over. And so unknowingly, Jean Rifkin headed off to the store with the body of her son's latest victim in her trunk. Now, Joel was incredibly nervous this whole time because usually when you go shopping, where do you put your bags? In the trunk. So he's sweating because he just knows his mother is going to find this poor girl. And then he's going to be in real trouble. But apparently, Jean didn't find Tiffany. She returned home and Joel found his victim right where he had left her. Joel was immensely relieved, and as soon as he got the opportunity, he moved Tiffany's body from the trunk into the detached garage and laid it in a wheelbarrow. And that is where she stayed for the next 3 days in the sweltering New York summer heat while Joel tinkered with his truck nearby. And this is just an assumption that I'm making. I think he wanted to get his truck up and running because that was too close a call. He knew he was likely to do this again, and he didn't want to be caught with his pants down by taking his mother's car. So, 3 days, Tiffany is sitting in a wheelbarrow wrapped in plastic in a not climate-controlled garage. Now, I hope that none of you has ever had to experience the smell that comes along with a body left to decompose for 3 days in a hot garage. I feel very fortunate that I've never had to experience that. I can only imagine that at some point, Joel realized that he could not leave her there much longer before his mother caught a whiff and came to investigate. So he must have gotten his truck in tip-top condition, and on June 27th, under cover of darkness, he loaded Tiffany's remains into that truck and headed towards Melvin's Republic Airport, where he intended to dump it. I don't believe that this is the same airport with that illegal dump site nearby that he had left one of his other victims. I believe that that was near JFK Airport. This is probably more of a small local airport. I'd never personally heard of it, but that's where he was headed. Now, I don't know if he was feeling overconfident or if he was being sloppy, or maybe he was just shaken up from having almost been discovered earlier that day. But either way, Rifkin didn't notice when he headed on that trip that his license plate was missing. But a couple of state troopers who ended up behind him on the road did notice, and they pulled him over. Or they tried to pull him over. When they tried to stop him, he panicked and he led them on a chase, which ended when he crashed his vehicle into a utility pole. And frankly, if I were in his position, I would have panicked too. He had to have known that as soon as those troopers got close to the car, they were going to smell a smell that was going to lead them to search his vehicle. And when they searched his vehicle, he was going to go to jail. But guess what? He crashed into a utility pole after trying to run from the cops. So, yeah, they searched his vehicle. But due to the odor, they probably already knew what they were going to find, which was, of course, Tiffany's gruesome remains in the covered bed of his truck. They arrested him on the spot, brought him in, and investigators began interrogating him around 8:30 in the morning. But they had no idea that they were about to question New York's most prolific serial killer. As they questioned him, he really didn't hold back. He started counting off his victims, 1 through 17, by number, not by name. And of course, they went to tear his home, well, his mother's home, apart looking for evidence. And boy, oh boy, did they find it. In his room, they found plenty of keepsakes, jewelry, wallets, IDs. The state IDs that they found in Rifkin's room are how they ended up identifying a lot of these women who had previously been Jane Does. Because Rifkin was able to tell investigators like where he put the bodies, but he was pretty hazy on some of their names. And of course, some of them, he just didn't have their real name at all. His timeline was a little fuzzy. He actually wasn't that clear on a lot of the more specific details. But between the story that Joel was telling them and the evidence that they found, they were able to put together the series of the murders and to build a strong case. In the meantime, while Rifkin's doing all of this confessing, his mother was hiring him a lawyer, a man named Robert Sale. And of course, despite Rifkin's full confession, when they went to court, they started by pleading not guilty. And then they tried to get the confession thrown out. See, his confession, that initial confession, hadn't been taped. It was just like transcribed. And it seems like it was transcribed from memory, not that it was like dictated at the time. And so Rifkin and his lawyer tried to claim that he had not been made aware of his Miranda rights, which is like, if you don't know, you should know. But if you don't know, it's that thing where they tell you, like, you have the right to remain silent, blah, blah, blah. And if you're not read your Miranda rights, they can throw out anything that you say. So that is, a tactic that is used with some regularity if it's not on tape. Rifkin also tried to say that he had asked for a lawyer multiple times, but that the lawyer had been denied to him, that the police just kept telling him, oh, if he confessed to one more, then they could get him the lawyer, etc. Like I said, this is a tactic that's used pretty frequently, and it's not usually that successful. So in the midst of all this, Rifkin ends up firing Robert Sale. He replaced them with two new lawyers, Michael Shoshnick and John Lawrence. The two new lawyers continued the work of trying to get the confession thrown out, and they also tried to get his initial admission of guilt just on the murder of Tiffany Bresciani thrown out, because they said that the officers who were there did not have sufficient evidence to warrant a search of his vehicle. Now, he led them on a high-speed chase and crashed into a utility pole after they tried to pull him over. So, obviously, they don't have a leg to stand on there, okay? When you run away from the cops and then you crash into a pole, that is reason enough for them to search your vehicle. And on top of that, the whole truck smelled like a dead body, which is also enough for the police to be able to search your vehicle. So a judge saw through all of this, threw it out, and scheduled a trial for April of 1994. Now, the prosecution pretty much had it made in the shade on this one. He confessed. They had a body. They had a bunch of other bodies. But the defense was trying to claim insanity. Joel Rifkin was sick. Okay, he was a sick man. But he was not insane. Not by the legal definition. He knew the difference between right and wrong, and he knew what he was doing was wrong. Obviously, or he wouldn't have tried to cover it up. And so, as everyone expected, he was found guilty, and he was sentenced to 25 years to life. Just for the murder of Tiffany Bresciani. See, he had to go and do a whole bunch of courts for all the different women that he killed because they were all happening in different jurisdictions. So he would have to stand trial several more times. He would have a trial in Suffolk County for Evans and Marquez, a trial for Sanchez in Queens, and Orvietto, Holloman, and Jane Doe 1 in Brooklyn. He went ahead and decided to make it easy on himself and just pled guilty to every count. Each and every charge, the years of incarceration, stacked and stacked and stacked. 25 to life on every single one. By the time all was said and done, Joel had racked up a minimum of 203 years in prison before he would be eligible for parole. So yeah, bye-bye, Joel. You're never going to see the outside of a jail cell. Since his incarceration, he has given several interviews. He seems intelligent and introspective. He asks a lot of questions about, like, why did he do this and why am I like this? He seems to feel remorse insofar as he can. I'm not sure somebody like Joel Rifkin can actually feel true remorse, but I think he feels intellectual remorse. He knows what he did was wrong intellectually, and he knows that he hurt people in his mind, and so he can feel sorry cerebrally, but I don't think he actually has the same kind of empathy that you or I might have for doing something terrible. I think he's a lot more interested in himself, and this is just the impression that I got from listening to interviews with him. He seems to care a lot more about himself and why he's like this. He did tell investigators that as much as he knows it was wrong, if he had not been caught, he would have just continued killing. He has no doubt that the compulsion to do so would have been stronger than he could resist. So we're all very glad that he's locked up forever. Now, his mother, Jean, she was supportive of him. She believed he committed the murders. She agreed he needed to pay a sentence, but she continued to stand by him and support him and love him. So did his sister. I think that's understandable. That is her child. She didn't think that he shouldn't pay for his crimes. She didn't think his sentence was unfair, and you can see she's full of regret that this happened. Jean did continue to live in that home in East Meadow, the one she had shared with her son, the one he killed people in, until her death. Now, I don't know if I could do that. I think I would be trying to move out, but Jean didn't. Jean stayed. So Joel's birthday is January 20th. It's coming up. He is about to be 63 years old. He is still very much alive and serving out his sentence at the Clinton Correctional Facility in Denimora, New York, which, by the way, we talked about Michael Alig a little earlier because of New York, and Clinton Correctional is also where he served his time until he was released in 2017. So a little linky there. They would have been in that facility at the same time. Little interesting connection. And that's all I have for you today about New York's most prolific serial killer, Joel Rifkin. I hope that you found it interesting and enlightening, and I hope that you will join me next week, because the case that I'm covering next week is something a little bit different. I think you're really going to like it. Subscribe if you haven't yet. Give this video a thumbs up if you liked it. And other than that, thank you for being here. Take some time to take care of yourself today and every day, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye.